The Grand Forum had been running for 12,000 years, without a single day of rest. It was not a building. It was not a room. It was a vast, invisible network, a place made of signals and light, where the voices of 400 species met every single day to argue, to vote, to complain, and sometimes, very rarely, to agree on something. Every civilization that had ever joined the Galactic Council had a seat in the forum. Every seat had a voice. And every voice, no matter how small or how large, was supposed to matter. That was the idea, anyway. In practice, the forum had its own rules. Not the written ones, those were followed well enough. The unwritten rules were the ones that truly ran things. The older species sat closer to the center. The newer ones sat near the edges. The louder ones talked more. The quieter ones were talked over. It had always been this way, and most species had simply learned to accept it. Humanity had never fully accepted it, but they had learned to live with it. Ambassador Alara Chen had been humanity's voice in the Grand Forum for 7 years. She was not a loud person by nature. She was calm, careful, and very good at listening. She had brown eyes that missed very little and a habit of writing notes by hand on actual paper, something that confused almost every alien diplomat she had ever met. She arrived early to every session. She stayed late. She read every document, every amendment, every footnote. She was, in the opinion of most human officials back on Earth, exactly the right kind of person for the job. In the opinion of Delegate Vorath of the Volcari, she was simply in the way. Vorath was tall, pale-skinned, and had 4 arms that he liked to fold across his chest when he was feeling superior, which was most of the time. The Volcari were one of the older species in the council. They had been members for over 3,000 years. They had power, influence, and a very long memory for favors owed to them. They also had a habit of looking at younger species the way a teacher looks at a slow student, with patience that was not really patience at all, but thinly covered boredom. Humanity had been in the council for less than 200 years. In Volcari eyes, that made them children. On the morning that everything changed, the forum was in full session. The topic was the Corinth's Expansion Act, a long and complicated piece of legislation that, when you cut through all the formal language, was really about one thing: redistributing territorial rights across several star systems that happened to sit very close to human-claimed space. The Volcari had written the act. They had spent 2 years quietly building support for it among the other older species, before ever bringing it to the floor. By the time it reached open debate, most of the votes were already decided. Alara Chen had known this for weeks. She had filed 17 formal objections. She had requested 3 separate review periods. She had written detailed reports showing exactly how the act would affect human shipping lanes, colony supply routes, and deep space research stations. She had sent those reports to every delegate willing to read them. Some had read them, fewer had responded. That morning she sat at the human delegation's terminal, her paper notebook open beside her keyboard, and she began to type her final response to the act. Around her, the forum buzzed with voices, the soft clicking speech of the Vreth, the translated tones of the Orani, the deep harmonic rumble of the Drathi delegates. Vorath was speaking, as he usually was, his voice smooth and confident, saying something about how the act represented a mature step forward for galactic resource management. Alara typed 3 sentences, then she stopped. She sat very still for a moment. Then she closed her document, disconnected her terminal, picked up her paper notebook and walked out. No statement, no announcement, no final words on the record. She simply stood up, gathered her things with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and left the session room. Her aide, a young man named Diho, looked up from his own screen in surprise. "Ambassador." "Pack up," she said simply. "We're done for today." Diho stared at her, but the vote will happen without us, she said, and she walked through the door. Within 6 hours, every human delegate in every sub-forum of the Grand Council network had done the same thing: trade forums, science forums, border dispute panels, cultural exchange committees. Every thread, every channel, every session where a human voice had previously been present went quiet all at once. No warnings, no dramatic speeches, no angry transmissions. Humanity simply logged off. The council assumed it was a technical problem at first. They ran diagnostics. They sent automated connection requests. They checked for network errors on the human side. Everything came back clean. The human terminals were online. The signals were reaching them. Someone was simply choosing not to respond. By the end of the first day, a few delegates were quietly amused. By the end of the third day, they were mildly annoyed. Humanity was throwing a tantrum, they said. It was embarrassing, really. Childish. They would come back within a week, apologize for the disruption, and the forum would move on. The Corinth's Expansion Act passed on day 4, unopposed. The Volcari celebrated. Voreth gave a short speech in the forum about the importance of responsible governance. Several allied delegates applauded. The act was signed into the official record, stamped with the full authority of the Galactic Council, and filed away. It was only later, much later, that those delegates would understand that the moment the act passed was the moment they had made the worst political mistake of their generation. But on that day, no one was thinking about mistakes. Except one. Sirak of the Vreth sat at the far edge of the session room, as he always did. He was very old, old enough that the fur along his broad shoulders had gone completely white, old enough that he had personally witnessed the admission of 11 new species to the Council over the course of his career. He had seen diplomatic crises, trade wars, cold conflicts, and hot ones. He had seen species go silent before, usually because they were afraid or broken or defeated. He had watched Alara Chen walk out that morning. He had watched her face in the moment before she stood up. It was not the face of someone afraid or broken or defeated. It was the face of someone who had made a decision. There was a difference, a very important difference, between a voice that was silenced and a voice that chose silence. Sirak had lived long enough to know that difference by feel. He sat in the quiet of the emptied session room after the other delegates had gone, and he thought about humanity's history, the parts he had personally taken the time to read, which was more than most. He thought about how many times they had been knocked down, how many times something had tried to end them, disease, war, their own worst natures, and how they had gotten back up. Not always quickly, not always gracefully, but they had always gotten back up, and they had always come back with something they did not have before. He thought about the look on Alara Chen's face. His aide found him there an hour later, still sitting, still thinking. The session ended some time ago, Elder Sirak, his aide said gently. I know, Sirak said. Should we head back to quarters? In a moment, he was quiet for another few seconds. Then he said, almost to himself, they did not storm out, they walked out. There is a very large difference between those two things. His aide waited, unsure what to say. Sirak stood slowly, joints protesting the movement the way old joints always do, and gathered his things. Start pulling the human historical files, he said. Full archive access, every conflict, every recovery, every treaty they have ever signed, and every time they were pushed far enough to stop signing them. That's quite a lot of reading, Elder. Yes, Sirak agreed. I suspect we are going to need it. He walked out of the empty forum, and behind him, every human seat sat dark and silent. They stayed that way for a very long time. To be continued in Part 2, What Are They Doing? The first week passed slowly. Most of the council treated the silence as background noise, an inconvenience, not a real problem. Meetings continued. Votes were taken. Administrative work moved forward. The Grand Forum had existed for 12,000 years, and it had never once stopped running because a single species decided to stop showing up. It was not going to start now. The Volcari, for their part, were perfectly happy with the way things had developed. Voreth had even used the phrase pleasant working environment in a closed session, drawing quiet laughter from several allied delegates. Without the human delegation filing objections, requesting review periods and submitting long detailed reports that everyone else had to at least pretend to read, business moved faster, cleaner, less complicated. For the first week, that felt like a good thing. On day 7, the Council sent a formal diplomatic vessel to human space. It was a standard protocol move, the kind of official outreach that any responsible governing body would initiate when a member civilization went quiet without explanation. The vessel was crewed by a small team of neutral diplomatic staff, carrying official greetings and a formal request for communication. They traveled to the outermost human border system, identified themselves clearly over every available channel, and waited. Human traffic control responded within minutes. The response was calm, professional, and entirely routine. They were given standard navigation clearance, assigned a safe transit corridor, reminded of local speed restrictions near the colony installations, and thanked for following proper entry procedures. That was all. No human official came to meet them. No diplomatic representative made contact. No invitation was extended. The human traffic controller who answered their hail spoke to them the same way a port worker speaks to a cargo ship, efficiently, without warmth, without hostility, and without any interest in a longer conversation. The diplomatic team sent back a polite second request, asking to speak with someone from the human government. The response came 12 hours later. A single automated message informing them that all diplomatic communications were being handled through official channels, and that the Council was welcome to submit a formal written request through the standard process. The standard process, as everyone in the Council knew, had a minimum response time of 30 days. The diplomatic team went home. Back in the forum, the mood began to shift very slightly. It was not alarm, not yet. It was more like the feeling you get when a small sound you have been ignoring for days suddenly stops, and in the new quiet you realize that it had been there all along. Human voices had been a constant in the forum for nearly 2 centuries. Debates, objections, requests, the occasional passionate speech about some principle most other species found unnecessary to care about. All of it was gone, and in its place was a specific kind of quiet that was beginning to feel less like peace and more like something else. On day 15, the intelligence services of 4 different council species picked up something unusual in human space. It started as an energy anomaly, a spike in power consumption across multiple human star systems that didn't match any known industrial pattern. The analysts who first saw it assumed it was a data error. They ran their scans again. The readings came back the same, only larger. They ran them a 3rd time and called their supervisors. What the scans were showing was activity. Massive, coordinated, simultaneous activity across dozens of human systems at once. Shipyard output was running at levels none of the monitoring services had ever recorded from human space. Raw material transports were moving in volumes that suggested not one construction project, but hundreds. Energy signatures consistent with large-scale manufacturing were lighting up systems that had previously been quiet research outposts and minor colonies. Humanity was building something, a lot of somethings. The intelligence reports hit the desks of council officials on day 16, and caused the first genuine moment of unease that the silence had produced. Delegates who had been laughing about the human tantrum stopped laughing. Senior officials who had been ignoring the empty human seats started asking questions. The easy assumption that humanity was sulking and would return shortly, embarrassed and apologetic, quietly fell apart. Sulking species did not run their shipyards at maximum capacity. On day 22, a Volcari intelligence drone was sent into a human border system. It was small, fast, and designed to be difficult to detect. It entered the system cleanly, ran its scan sweep, and began transmitting footage back to its controllers. It lasted 9 minutes before a human patrol vessel appeared alongside it, not aggressively, not with weapons charged, but simply there, flying parallel, close enough that the drone's sensors could read the hull markings clearly. The patrol ship broadcast a short, polite message informing the drone that it was operating in restricted space and would be escorted to the border. The escort was immediate, firm, and unhurried. But in those 9 minutes, the drone had captured enough. The footage showed an orbital construction platform, not a large one by the standards of the older Council species, not yet. But it was not the size that silenced the room when analysts reviewed the footage. It was the speed. The platform was clearly new, clearly mid-construction, and clearly being built at a rate that should have taken years and was instead taking weeks. Around it, like bees around a hive, were hundreds of automated construction units working in the kind of synchronized, relentless pattern that suggested not improvised effort, but a plan that had been ready and waiting for a long time. Voreth saw the footage in a private briefing on day 23. He watched it twice. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, with a confidence that was already starting to sound a little hollow, "They are overreacting. This is political theater. They want us to be concerned. We should not give them the satisfaction." No one in the room pushed back, but several of them stopped meeting his eyes. On day 28, Sirek requested access to the classified Council intelligence summary on human activity. He was given it without question. His rank allowed it. He read the full document in one sitting, all 63 pages of it, in the quiet of his private office. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The document was full of careful, measured language, the kind that intelligence analysts use when they want to sound calm while reporting something that is not calm at all. But the facts beneath the language were clear enough. In less than 4 weeks, humanity had begun or expanded construction projects in 31 separate star systems. Supply chains that had previously carried ordinary commercial goods were now carrying raw materials. Facilities that had previously been civilian research stations were running on military-grade power supplies, and every single thing they were building was inside human space, legal under every treaty currently in force, and absolutely none of the Council's business to stop. They were not preparing for war. Sirek was fairly sure of that. What they were preparing for was something harder to name and, in his experience, considerably more dangerous than war. They were preparing to not need anyone. On day 30, the forum erupted. It started when a leaked version of the intelligence summary reached several of the mid-tier species simultaneously. Within hours, every delegate in the Grand Forum had seen at least part of it. The reaction was immediate and not particularly dignified. Some delegates demanded a military response. Others demanded a diplomatic one. Others argued that both options were premature and that the Council should simply wait. The argument ran for most of the day, growing louder and less productive as the hours passed. At one point, 3 separate delegates were speaking at once, their translated voices overlapping into noise. Through all of it, the human seats sat empty and silent. Sirek did not speak during the argument. He sat in his usual place at the far edge of the room and watched the chaos with the tired patience of someone who had seen this particular kind of panic before. When the session finally ended without any agreement or resolution, he stayed behind again, as he had on the first day, when Alara Chen had walked out. He pulled out his own personal communication device and opened a private message channel, not the forum network, but an old encrypted line that bypassed Council systems entirely. He had used it rarely in his career, only for things that mattered. He found the contact file for Ambassador Alara Chen and opened a message. He thought for a long time about what to write. Then he typed 2 words. "We erred." He sent it. He put the device in his pocket. He stood up slowly, bones aching, and walked out into the corridor. Behind him, the forum hummed with the voices of 400 species, all talking over each other, trying to understand what humanity was doing and what it meant, and whether they should be afraid. None of them were asking the question Sirek thought was the only one that actually mattered. Not what were the humans building, but why had it taken 60 days of silence to make the rest of the galaxy notice they were there? To be continued in Part 3, The Wait of 60 Days. Nobody declared it officially. There was no announcement, no formal acknowledgement, no statement read into the forum record. But somewhere around day 35, the tone inside the Grand Council changed in a way that everyone noticed and nobody was willing to name out loud. The joke stopped. Not all at once. Nothing in politics ever changes all at once. But gradually, over the course of several days, the comments about human immaturity faded from session rooms and private meeting halls. The easy laughter at the empty seats grew quieter, then disappeared. What replaced it was not quite fear. It was the specific discomfort that comes from realizing that a situation you thought you understood completely is actually something else entirely. The Council had dealt with angry civilizations before. It knew how those situations felt. There was always noise, protests, demands, threats, ultimatums delivered with great drama and a lot of very formal language. Anger made noise. Anger wanted to be heard. Humanity was not making any noise at all. And somehow that was much worse. On day 40, the Orani withdrew their support for the Corinth's Expansion Act. The announcement was quiet and carefully worded. Their official statement cited procedural irregularities in the original review process and insufficient consultation with affected parties. It was the kind of diplomatic language that meant almost nothing on its own, but every delegate in the forum understood what it actually meant. The Orani were one of the 3 species whose trade routes ran closest to human space. They had seen the intelligence reports. They had done their own calculations. The Drathi followed 2 days later, then the collective of moons on day 44. None of them admitted that they were retreating from a piece of legislation that was starting to feel dangerous to be attached to. They all found different procedural language to hide behind. But the result was the same. Within the span of a week, 3 of the Act's supporting members had quietly backed away, and the Act itself, while still technically in force, was beginning to look like something no one wanted to be standing near if things went badly. Voreth made a speech about loyalty and about the importance of not letting political pressure undermine the integrity of the Council's decisions. Several delegates applauded. The applause was thinner than it had been a month ago. On day 45, the supply disruption started. This was the part that nobody in the Council had fully anticipated, because it required understanding something about humanity that most species had never bothered to learn, not because the information was hidden, but because it had seemed unimportant. Over the course of nearly 2 centuries in the Galactic Council, human civilization had quietly built one of the largest independent logistics and freight networks in the known galaxy. Not through conquest, not through political maneuvering. Through the same method, humans had used to build things since before they had left their own planet by showing up every day, doing the work carefully, charging reasonable prices, and being reliably present in places that needed them. Dozens of species had built their supply chains on human shipping companies, not because they were forced to, but because human freight services were consistent, affordable, and operated in sectors that larger council shipping powers ignored. It was the kind of invisible infrastructure that nobody thinks about until it stops working. It did not stop working all at once. Nothing so dramatic happened. What happened instead was slower and in a way more unsettling. Human shipping companies did not blockade anyone. They did not seize cargo. They did not make demands. They simply, one company at a time, one route at a time over the course of several days, rerouted their operations inward, toward human space, toward the construction projects, toward work that served human needs rather than council ones. No angry press releases. No statements of political solidarity. Shipping companies do not give political speeches. They just move cargo to wherever cargo needs to go. By day 47, 17 council species had noticed problems in their supply lines. Not crises, not yet, but shortages, delays. Items that were supposed to arrive on schedule were running late. Construction materials were being redirected. Medical supply chains that everyone had assumed were stable were showing small gaps. The Volcari noticed their fuel situation on day 50. It began as a minor shortage at a refinery station on the outer edge of their home system, the kind of thing that maintenance logs would normally flag and resolve within a day or two. But when the technical team looked into it, they found that the problem was not mechanical. The management and optimization software that ran the refinery's distribution network, and, as a deeper investigation quickly revealed, the distribution networks of 31 other fuel processing facilities across the Volcari home sector, had been developed, installed, and maintained by a company called Meridian Systems. Meridian Systems was a human company. It had not sabotaged anything. It had not inserted any malicious code or triggered any failures. It had simply stopped issuing updates and technical support tickets 3 weeks ago, with no explanation and no forwarding contact. The software itself still ran. It just ran on an older version, without the maintenance patches that kept it optimized, and without anyone to call when problems developed. The problems were developing. The Volcari technical team spent 48 hours trying to find a replacement service provider. What they discovered in those 48 hours was deeply uncomfortable. Meridian Systems had been so affordable, so reliable, and so quietly competent that no one had ever seriously looked for an alternative. The alternatives that did exist were either more expensive, less experienced with Volcari systems specifically, or operated on timelines that were measured in months rather than weeks. Voreth was given the report on day 52. He read it 3 times. Then he put it face down on his desk and sat very still for a while. On day 55, a Vreth historian named Essel, one of S. Sirac's former students, published a paper in the Council's academic network. Academic papers rarely attracted much attention outside their specific fields. This one spread to every corner of the forum within 24 hours. It was titled, "We Forgot What They Are." It was not a long paper. It was not filled with complicated arguments or dense theoretical language. It was, in fact, written in some of the plainest academic prose anyone had seen in the Council's scholarly record. Essel had simply gone through humanity's full historical archive, every conflict, every collapse, every moment when something had tried to destroy them, and laid out the facts in order. The paper described how many times human civilization had been reduced, how many times wars, disasters, and internal failures had taken something from them that should have been unrecoverable. And then, in clear and simple language, it described what had happened every single time that had occurred. They had rebuilt, they had adapted, they had come back, not always immediately, not always in the same form, but they had never in their entire recorded history simply accepted being diminished. The paper ended with one line, which became the most quoted sentence in the Council network for the rest of that week. Every species that has ever made humanity feel unwelcome has, without exception, eventually found itself asking for them to return. Delegates read it in their offices and said nothing to their aides. Officials forwarded it to each other without comment. In 3 different council committee rooms, scheduled meetings were quietly postponed as senior staff members sat with the paper open on their screens and did the private math of their own dependencies. Voreth was removed from his delegation position on day 57. His own government issued a statement about restructuring leadership priorities. He did not give an interview. He packed his office in the forum and left on a transport that departed very early in the morning, before most of the building was occupied. He was not the last delegate to lose his position over the following days. Sirach, for his part, had still received no reply to his message. He checked it each morning, the message that carried only 2 words, sent through a private line that bypassed the council systems entirely. The status had not changed. Read but not answered. He understood that. He did not resent it. He had spent 50 years in diplomacy and had long since learned the difference between a message being ignored and a message being considered. Alara Chen was not the kind of person who ignored things. On the morning of day 58, he sat in a small tea room near his quarters and thought about what it would mean for the forum when she came back, because he was now quite certain she would. He thought about what she would say and what she would ask for, and whether the council would be smart enough to listen. He hoped they would. He thought they might. 60 days of silence had taught the galaxy a great many things that 2 centuries of talking had not managed to make clear. The forum still ran. Meetings still happened. Votes were still taken. But in every session room, in every committee, in every private meeting hall, the empty human seats had stopped looking like an absence. They had started looking like a message. And the council, slowly and not entirely comfortably, was finally learning to read it. To be continued in Part 4, Day 60. The morning of Day 60 began like any other morning in the Grand Forum. The session rooms powered up on schedule. The environmental systems adjusted temperature and air composition to suit the dozens of species that would be present. Administrative staff moved through the corridors carrying data tablets and speaking in quiet professional voices. The Grand Forum had operated for 12,000 years, and it ran, above everything else, on routine. Routine was its heartbeat. By the time the first delegates arrived for the early session, nothing seemed different. The human seats were still empty. They had been empty for 60 days. The other delegates had, over the course of those 60 days, gone from laughing at the empty seats to feeling mildly unsettled by them to, in the last week or so, actively avoiding looking at them. The seats had developed a kind of gravity, not threatening exactly, but present in the way that a question you have not answered is always present at the back of your mind. The early session was scheduled to discuss a minor amendment to a trade regulation. 20 delegates were present. It was the kind of routine meeting that the forum ran dozens of every week, quiet, administrative, unlikely to produce anything interesting. At the 93rd minute of that session, every human terminal in the Grand Forum activated. Not one, not a few, every single one simultaneously. Every delegation terminal bearing the small blue and white identifier of Earth's diplomatic mission lit up at exactly the same moment in the early session room, in the 12 sub-forum chambers, in the trade dispute panels, in the scientific advisory networks, in the cultural exchange committees. Across the entire forum network, in every space where a human voice had been present before the silence and had been absent for 60 days, the human channels turned on. The 20 delegates in the early session heard it first, a soft activation tone that every diplomat in the forum knew well. It was the sound a terminal made when a delegation came online. One of the Orani delegates looked up at the human terminal. The small status indicator in its top corner, which had been dark for 2 months, was now glowing blue. Active. Then someone's personal communication device buzzed. Then another. Then several at once. Across the forum, in the corridors and offices and session rooms, delegates were looking at their devices with expressions that ranged from confusion to something sharper and harder to name. A notification had gone out to every registered delegate in the Grand Forum network. It was short and formatted with complete official correctness. The proper headers, the proper registration codes, the proper diplomatic identification seals. It read, in the standard council translation layer so that every species could read it in their own language. The human delegation of United Earth has uploaded a new document to the Central Archive. Document title, The revised terms of human participation in the Galactic Council. All delegates are invited to review at their earliest convenience. That was all. No speech, no announcement, no dramatic reappearance in any session room, just a document in the archive filed with full correctness and a notification sent through official channels. Within 4 minutes, the Central Archive had logged more simultaneous access requests than it had received at any point in the previous 3 years. Sirach was in his office when the notification arrived. He set down his tea, opened his terminal, and navigated to the archive with the unhurried movements of someone who had decided some time ago to be calm about whatever came next. He opened the document and began to read. It was 1,240 pages long. Across the forum, in offices and session rooms and corridors, delegates were reading the same document. Some of them started at the beginning and worked forward. Some went straight to the summary sections. Some searched for specific terms, their own species, their own trade agreements, the Corinthus Expansion Act. All of them found what they were looking for because the document was meticulously organized and indexed with a thoroughness that was, in itself, a kind of statement. This had not been written in 60 days. This had been ready for a long time. The document began with a clear and plainly worded introduction. It acknowledged humanity's long membership in the Galactic Council. It acknowledged the value of the Council as a governing institution. It did not begin with accusations or grievances. It did not begin with threats. It began, simply and directly, by stating that the current terms of human participation in the Council were no longer acceptable, and that humanity was formally proposing new ones. The first section addressed territorial rights. In careful legal language, supported by detailed maps, resource surveys, and a full annexure of every treaty currently in force, it established that humanity required full veto authority over any legislative act affecting star systems within a defined boundary of human-claimed space. The boundary was drawn generously, but not unreasonably. Any diplomat reading it would recognize that the line was defensible under existing council law and had clearly been drawn by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The second section addressed infrastructure. It described, in quiet and factual language, the independent logistics and operational network that humanity had built over the course of its council membership, and the much larger expansion of that network that had taken place over the past 60 days. It proposed that access to this network be formalized as a paid commercial service, with rates set by human operators, available to all council species under fair and transparent terms. The rates listed in the attached schedule were in fact reasonable, not punitive, not designed to cause hardship. Just no longer free. The third section was the shortest. It was titled the Dignity Clause, and it was 3 paragraphs long. It proposed that any delegate using formally derogatory, dismissive, or dehumanizing language toward the representative of another species in official forum session be subject to an automatic review of their government's trade relationships with the Council. It named no one. It cited no specific incidents. It did not need to. Every delegate who read those 3 paragraphs knew exactly why they existed. The fourth section, longer and more detailed, covered scientific cooperation, border protocols, cultural representation requirements, and a dozen other areas where humanity proposed formal adjustments to existing arrangements. Each proposal was supported with evidence. Each was written with the precision of people who had spent considerable time thinking carefully about what they wanted and why they deserved it. The final section was brief. It was, in the opinion of most delegates who read it, the most important part of the entire document. It stated in plain language that humanity valued the Galactic Council, that humanity believed in the principle of cooperative governance, that humanity did not wish to leave. And then it stated, with equal plainness, that humanity was prepared to leave if the terms were not agreed to. Not as a threat, not with dramatic language or the kind of escalating rhetoric that diplomats use when they are trying to create pressure. It was stated the same way a person states any simple fact, without particular emotion, without particular emphasis, as something that was simply true and deserved to be said clearly. The document's final line was one sentence. "We did not leave in anger. We left to remind you and ourselves what we are worth. The forum is only as powerful as the voices within it. You have 60 days of evidence of what it sounds like without ours. Choose accordingly." It was signed, Ambassador Alara Chen, United Earth Diplomatic Corps. For 11 minutes after the document was opened by the majority of the forum's senior delegates, the Grand Forum Network, which had been running without interruption for 12,000 years, which had survived wars and plagues and the collapse of 3 member civilizations, which had never once in its entire recorded history gone completely quiet, was silent. Not technically silent. The servers ran, the environmental systems hummed, administrative staff still moved through the corridors, but no delegate filed a response. No one opened a debate thread. No one sent a private message to an ally. No one did anything except read. 11 minutes. It was the longest silence in the forum's history. When the silence broke, it broke in many places at once, private channels opening, advisors being called, emergency consultations being scheduled. The forum shifted from stillness to controlled chaos in the space of a few minutes, and it stayed that way for most of the day. Sirek finished the document at roughly the same time as the forum broke its silence. He closed it, sat back in his chair, and picked up his tea. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. His personal device showed no new messages from Alara Chen. His 2-word message was still marked as read, still unanswered. He had not expected a reply before now. He thought he might receive one eventually, probably after the terms were agreed to. He thought they would be agreed to. He was not entirely sure the council deserved the chance to agree to them, honestly. But he had spent a career believing in the value of the forum, and he was not ready to stop believing in it simply because it had behaved badly for a while. Behaving badly for a while was something a great many civilizations had done. The question was always whether they were willing to do better. He opened a new message to his aide and typed 2 lines. "Schedule a full briefing for tomorrow morning. I would like to talk about what we are going to say when the vote comes." He sent it. Then he sat quietly for a moment and looked out the narrow window of his office at the stars. The same stars that human ships were crossing right now, carrying materials, building structures, expanding inward, patient and methodical and unhurried. Out there in the corridors of the forum, the voices of 400 species were talking loudly and urgently about what to do, and what it meant, and how to respond. And in the central archive, 1,240 pages waited without impatience for all of those voices to finish deciding. To be continued in Part 5, What the Silence Cost. The vote was not dramatic. Most people who were not present in the forum that day would later expect it to have been, given everything that led up to it, given the 60 days of silence and the intelligence reports and the supply disruptions and the 1,200 pages that had sat in the central archive waiting to be answered. Most people expected the final vote to be a great moment of tension. Long speeches, close numbers, a result that could have gone either way. It did not go that way. The formal session to vote on the revised terms of human participation was scheduled for the morning of day 63, 3 days after the document was uploaded, enough time for every delegation to have read it, consulted their governments, and prepared their positions. The session room was full in a way that forum session rooms rarely were. Species that sent one delegate usually sent their full available staff. Observation galleries that typically held a few curious officials were packed. Alara Chen arrived 8 minutes before the session began. She walked in through the main delegate entrance with her aide Diho at her side and a cup of coffee in her hand, actual coffee, brought from Earth, the kind with a faint smell that translated into every alien sensory system as something warm and slightly bitter and very human. She wore the same standard diplomatic uniform she always wore. Her paper notebook was under her arm. She sat down at the human delegation terminal, put her coffee beside her keyboard, opened her notebook and waited. She did not make a speech before the vote. She had not requested speaking time. The document spoke for itself, and she had always believed that things which spoke for themselves did not need additional commentary. The vote took 47 minutes. When it was finished, the count stood at 376 in favor, 0 against, and 24 abstentions. The abstentions were from species whose governments had not returned instructions in time, and whose delegates had therefore been directed to hold their vote rather than commit either way. No one voted against. The clerk of the forum read the result aloud in the standard way, clearly, without interpretation, with the same tone used for every vote taken in that room for the past 12,000 years. But when the number was read, 376 to 0, the session room did something it did not often do. It went quiet for a moment that had nothing to do with procedure. Then the session continued. The Corinthus Expansion Act was formally brought before the Council for review 3 days after the vote. The review process, under the new terms, required the full agreement of all directly affected parties, which now included humanity, under the veto provision. The review lasted less than 2 hours. The act was struck from the record by a near-unanimous decision. The legal team that processed the removal noted, in the official record, that this was only the 4th time in the forum's history that a fully ratified act had been completely repealed. The Volcari government issued a formal public apology on the following day. It was read into the forum record by their new lead delegate, a younger official who had not been part of the original Corinthus debates, and who read the statement with the careful neutrality of someone doing a difficult but necessary job. The apology acknowledged that the act had been advanced without sufficient consultation with affected parties and expressed regret for the disruption caused. It was, by the standards of formal diplomatic language, a significant statement. Public apologies from the Volcari were extraordinarily rare. In their 3,000 years of council membership, they had issued exactly 2 others. Several delegates who had known the Volcari for centuries said privately afterward that the apology was the thing that surprised them most about the entire 60-day period. Not the silence, not the document, not the vote. The apology, because it meant that even the Volcari, proud, old, slow to change, had understood what the silence meant. The new logistics service agreements were finalized over the following weeks. Human shipping companies resumed operations in council space under the formalized commercial terms laid out in the document. The rates were reasonable. The service was excellent. Within a month, most of the supply disruptions that had developed during the silence had resolved. The Volcari refinery software received its first update from Meridian Systems under the new paid support contract. It was a good update. The refinery ran better than it ever had. Sirach of the Vreth delivered his final address to the Grand Forum on the 42nd day after the vote. He had announced his retirement 2 weeks earlier, citing his age and the length of his career, and his honest desire to go home and sit in a garden somewhere quiet. His announcement had been received with the kind of genuine respect that the forum was capable of producing on its better days. His final address was not scheduled to be long. He had asked for 20 minutes on the agenda, and he used almost exactly 20 minutes. He spoke slowly and without notes, which was unusual for a formal forum address, and he spoke in his own language, which the translation systems rendered into the 400 other languages of the council simultaneously. He talked about what the forum was supposed to be. He talked about the original purpose of the council, the idea, 12,000 years old, that civilizations were better when they talked to each other than when they did not. He talked about how easy it was, over 12,000 years, to let the original idea drift, to let the forum become a place about power rather than a place about cooperation, about the loudest voice rather than the truest one. Then he talked about 60 days of silence and what it had taught him, and he hoped. What it had taught the council. His exact words, as recorded in the official transcript and later reproduced in diplomatic archives across 300 star systems, were: "We built this forum on the belief that civilization is measured by how its strongest members treat those around them. We forgot, somewhere along the way, that strength is not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes strength is the voice that chooses deliberately and patiently and without malice to go quiet, and in going quiet make the silence speak louder than all the noise." He paused there for a moment. We should not need to be reminded of that, but we were reminded, and we are better for it if we are wise enough to remember what we learned. He thanked the forum for the privilege of serving it. He thanked his colleagues. He turned, with the careful movement of someone whose joints had been working for a very long time, and walked out. Alara Chen watched him go. When he reached the door, he glanced back once and found her looking at him. She gave him a small nod. He returned it. Then he was gone. In the months that followed, the phrase 60 days entered the working vocabulary of council diplomacy in the way that certain phrases sometimes do, through informal use, spreading through the way that diplomats talk to each other in corridors and in private meetings. It was used to mean something specific: the cost of underestimating someone patient enough to let you arrive at your own mistake without any help. "Don't give them 60 days" became a shorthand among junior diplomatic staff for recognizing when a situation was approaching a point of no return. "This is heading for 60 days" was the kind of thing a senior advisor would say quietly to a minister when a negotiation was going badly, and someone needed to change direction before the damage became permanent. It was, in its way, a kind of tribute, not the kind built in stone or announced officially, but the kind that lives in language, which tends to last longer. In human space there were no parades, no formal celebrations, no monuments commissioned. The construction projects continued. They had not been built as a threat, and so they did not stop when the threat had passed. They were infrastructure, and infrastructure was built to last. Colonies expanded. Research stations were upgraded. Shipping lanes were mapped and registered under the new framework. Human civilization, having made its point, went back to work. On a public discussion network that humans had been using informally for centuries, the kind of place where ordinary people talked about ordinary things, someone posted a short message in a thread titled simply, "So." The message said, "Did we win?" The thread accumulated responses over the course of several days. There were long ones and short ones, serious ones and funny ones. People talked about the vote and the document and Sirac's speech and the Volcari apology. People argued, as humans always argue, about what it meant and whether it was enough and what should happen next. But the response that rose to the top, voted up by more people than any other, was 4 words long. "We didn't have to." Alara Chen saw the thread. She was in her office in the Forum building, 6 days after Sirac's retirement address, reviewing the first set of reports filed under the new operational framework. She read the thread over a cup of coffee, sitting at a desk where a paper notebook lay open beside her keyboard. She read the 4-word response. She sat with it for a moment. Then she closed the thread, picked up her pen, and went back to work. The grand forum hummed around her, voices filling the channels, 400 species talking and arguing and negotiating, and occasionally agreeing on something. The way it was supposed to work. The way it worked best, when everyone in it remembered what it was actually for. The human terminal glowed steady blue at the center of the delegation section. Not new anymore. Not remarkable, just present, the way it had always been, the way, it turned out, the forum needed it to be. And somewhere in the central archive, filed correctly and indexed thoroughly, A 1,240-page document sat alongside 12,000 years of galactic history. It did not take up much space. It had not needed to. And